The rain hit the glass walls of the Whitmore Pediatric Surgical Center in long slanted lines, and inside, every surface still gleamed as if it had been polished an hour earlier. White stone floors caught the cold blue light. Through the transparent partitions, investors and reporters could see the simulation rooms, the automated supply corridors, and the new control hub, where every monitor glowed a confident green. It was supposed to be the proudest evening of Whitmore Medical Systems. Outside, the storm was already building over Chicago, but no one inside the building seemed to notice. Flynn Mercer stood near a secondary breaker panel at the far end of the control room, trying not to take up space. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair cut short and a face that looked too tired for a man so young. His shirt was clean but creased. His shoes were old. The tool bag at his feet had been carried into more emergency rooms than most of the people in the building had ever seen. He had been hired for a small contract job, a pre-event check on one auxiliary panel, and the plan had been simple. Confirm everything was fine, sign the form, and leave before the cameras arrived. Behind him, his daughter Bridget held the back of his sleeve in one hand and a worn rabbit toy in the other. She was 6 years old, small for her age, with light brown hair that always looked slightly mussed and big, observant eyes. The rabbit had been her mother's last gift, and she carried it everywhere, including into rooms where she clearly did not belong. Flynn had just placed his palm against the cabinet when he heard it. A small, dry click from inside the automatic transfer switch. Not a fault, not a fail, just a sound that did not belong. He glanced at the analog dial bolted to the side of the panel. The needle twitched, settled, and twitched again. The central display still read green, but Flynn did not trust the central display. He trusted the small things. He stepped over to Leon Hartwell, the lead engineer, a man of 40 in a tailored suit who carried himself like the smartest person in any room. Flynn kept his voice low. He said the transfer relay sounded slow. He said if the grid wavered during full load, the controller might hang between sources for half a second longer than it should. Leon's jaw tightened. He did not appreciate being approached by a contracted technician in front of investors. He told Flynn that the system had been certified 3 times in the last quarter, that the auxiliary backups were fully sealed, and that an outside hand was not needed. Flynn did not push. He only said that he was not telling them it was broken. He was telling them it might not transfer fast enough when the load climbed. Audrey Whitmore heard him. She turned. She was 28 years old, the kind of beautiful that made rooms briefly forget what they were doing. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders. Her cream bodycon dress and V-neck line had been chosen carefully for the cameras. She looked at Flynn's wrinkled shirt. She looked at the old tool bag. Then her eyes traveled past him to the small girl holding a rabbit, and something in her tightened. To Audrey, the picture in front of her was not a warning. It was a problem on the most important day of her year. She crossed the floor in 3 measured steps. The room hushed without being asked. Audrey stopped close enough that everyone in the control hub could hear her clearly. "You are out of your depth," she said. "Stay back." A few of the engineers laughed under their breath. One investor glanced at Flynn with something close to pity. Bridget pressed herself against her father's leg and lowered her face into the rabbit's fur, as if she could disappear into it. Flynn did not answer. He set his hand on his daughter's shoulder and drew her gently behind him. He took half a step back from the panel. But his eyes did not leave the cabinet, because somewhere in his chest, a steady, unwelcome certainty had already started to grow. To understand why Flynn did not argue, the room would have needed to know who he had been before the wrinkled shirt. Once he had worn a uniform. Once, his name had been on duty rosters in places where the lights were not allowed to fail. He had spent years in emergency electrical systems for military medical units, on hospital ships that rolled in heavy seas, in field surgery wings where a single drop circuit could mean a child never woke up again. He had stabilized power during storms that had taken out half a coastline. He had learned in those years that the most dangerous failure in any building was never the loud one. It was the small click that no one else could hear. When his wife died, the routine that had defined his life simply stopped. She had asked him, quietly and without dramatics in the last weeks of her illness, to make sure their daughter never grew up with a father who was always somewhere else. Flynn took that promise seriously. He left the high-pressure assignments. He took the contract jobs that let him be home before dinner. He braided Bridget's hair. He learned which lunchbox shape she preferred. He memorized her allergies the way other men memorized stock tickers. The work paid less. The respect paid even less. To a stranger in a corner office, he no longer looked like a man who had ever stood between a generator and a child's heartbeat. He carried that without resentment. The thing he could not carry was the look on his daughter's face when somebody made him small in front of her. Bridget was not a loud child. She did not announce her feelings the way some 6-year-olds did. But she watched. She had watched her mother grow thin. She had watched her father pretend not to be tired. She knew, without anyone explaining it, that the world frequently failed to see her father correctly. To Bridget, Flynn was the strongest person on earth, the most patient, the most reliable. So when she heard a beautiful woman in a beautiful dress order him to stay back, she did not feel embarrassed for herself. She felt confused. Why would anyone speak that way to the best man she knew? Audrey Whitmore had not been born sharp. The sharpness had been built, layer by layer, in rooms where men twice her age had assumed she would fail. She had inherited Whitmore Medical Systems at a moment when most analysts predicted it would be sold for parts within 18 months. In 4 years, she had turned that prediction into a footnote. She had worked 16-hour days. She had taught herself to read engineering reports the way some people read novels. She had learned how to walk into a board meeting and not flinch when the oldest man at the table asked her if she had any actual experience. But success had not made her gentler. It had made her vigilant. She had come to believe that any visible mistake on a public day would be the one that defined her. So she controlled the room. She controlled the lighting cues. She controlled the order of presentations. And when something stepped outside her plan, even something small, even something dressed in a wrinkled shirt and trailing a child, she reacted before she thought. The words she had used had not been chosen carefully. They had been chosen quickly, the way a frightened person chooses a lock. She did not yet know that she had not silenced a contractor. She had picked a fight with the only man in the building who could save her evening. In the next several minutes, while Audrey continued her preparations, Flynn stood quietly and listened. He did not stare at the central display, because the central display was the easiest thing to fool. He listened to the test cycles instead. The surgical lamps came online with a faint hum. The ventilator simulations engaged. The clean air pressure system rose to nominal. To everyone else, those sounds were noise. To Flynn, they were a sentence with a missing word. The transfer switch was not failing outright. It was hesitating. The control logic was receiving input slightly slower than the actual current was changing. If the grid simply died, the system would probably catch itself. But if the grid wavered, dipping in and out the way it sometimes did when lightning struck near a substation, the controller could become trapped in indecision. It would refuse to fully commit to either source. The hospital would not lose all its power. It would lose enough to matter, in exactly the rooms where losing any power was not allowed. He weighed whether to speak again. He felt Bridget's small hand tug at his. She was looking up at him, asking without words for him to please not invite another insult. Flynn looked down at her, and for a moment he was simply a father caught between two duties. Speak up, and let his daughter watch him be mocked again. Stay silent, and walk away from a system that he knew was holding its breath. He chose neither. He stayed where he was, near the auxiliary panel, close enough to act if he needed to. He did not call attention to himself. He simply did not leave. Bridget kept her face turned into his side. After a while, she whispered that she did not want to go out into the hallway. She did not want to leave him alone with people who were not nice. Flynn knelt down, slow and careful, until his eyes met hers. She asked him why the lady had spoken to him like that. Flynn did not want to teach her bitterness. He told her gently that sometimes people looked too quickly and understood too slowly. Bridget thought about that. Then she said, very seriously, that he knew how to fix things. Flynn smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had become rare on his face. He told her that knowing how to fix things did not always mean people would let you help. Bridget pressed her rabbit harder against her cheek. She told him she would always let him help. She told him she would let him fix anything she ever broke. He drew her into a quick hug, his hand cupping the back of her small head, and he held her there longer than the moment required, because the rest of the room had no idea how much his daughter's voice had just steadied him. The presentation began on time. Audrey took the small stage at the front of the control hub with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed every breath. Her voice was clear, warm enough to seem human, sharp enough to seem expert. She spoke about pediatric surgery. She spoke about the children who would be saved by faster, smarter operating environments. The screen behind her displayed a stylized model of an intelligent surgical suite, where lighting, oxygen flow, clean air pressure, temperature, and electrical loads adjusted themselves in real time to the demands of each procedure. The investors listened. Several leaned forward. William Prescott, a senior board member of 60 years and few unnecessary words, watched her with quiet approval. He had seen many young executives talk well and execute poorly. So far, Audrey was not one of them. Audrey introduced Dr. Amanda Price, the surgeon who would lead the new pediatric wing. Amanda was 35, calm, with the unsentimental steadiness of someone who had repaired children's hearts at 3 in the morning. She did not waste words on visions. She said, simply, that technology only mattered when it served the patient on the table. The line landed in the room the way she meant it to. It planted a small, important truth before anyone realized they would need it. Outside, the rain grew heavier. A flicker of lightning lit the windows in the corner of the room. A few investors glanced toward the storm and then away, reassured by the building they were standing in. Leon Hartwell gave the order to engage the full-load simulation. The surgical lamps went bright. The ventilators ran their test sequences. The air handlers climbed to peak output. Every screen reported nominal. Audrey allowed herself a small, controlled smile. This was the moment she had built 4 years toward. Flynn heard the click again. This time it did not return to silence. It stretched, just a little, across half a beat. Flynn straightened. Bridget felt the change in him before she saw it, the way she always did, and she lifted her face from the rabbit. She whispered to him. Flynn did not look at her. He looked at the panel and said, very quietly, to stay close. A second later, lightning struck somewhere near the substation outside. The lights in the control hub blinked, just once, almost gently. The central display flickered green, then yellow, then red. The system reported a transfer loop fault. Leon's first instinct was to maintain composure. He told the engineers it was a signal anomaly, but the indicators kept climbing into red. Half the building's non-essential circuits had already dropped. Decorative lighting in the lobby died. A row of hallway monitors went black. Inside the operating zones, however, the system was caught exactly where Flynn had warned it would be. Hesitating between primary and backup, refusing to fully release one or commit to the other. Then the doors of the control hub burst open. A nurse came in fast, breath short. An ambulance had just arrived. Henry Miller, 8 years old, had collapsed after a traffic accident with cardiac complications. The nearest hospital was full, and the transfer time too risky. The surgery had to begin here, in operating theater number 2, and it had to begin now. Dr. Amanda Price did not speak gently. She turned to Leon and asked whether Theater 2 had stable power. Leon stared at the screen. He did not answer. Amanda asked again, and her voice was no longer the voice of a presenter. She told him she needed an answer in 30 seconds. Nobody spoke. Audrey stood very still. The room she had spent 4 years building was quietly crumbling around her. The investors had begun to murmur. 2 reporters were already being escorted out by security. William Prescott rose slowly to his feet and looked at her without anger, which was somehow worse than anger. Leon tried to force a manual transfer through the control software. The system locked him out. The protective relays were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. They were refusing a command that might overload the line. The same safety logic that protected the building during normal operation was now keeping the building from saving a child. Flynn did not say anything self-satisfied. He did not allow even a flicker of it onto his face. He just watched the screens and felt the ground shrink under everyone around him. Bridget looked at her father, then at Audrey. The beautiful woman who had laughed at her father a few minutes earlier was no longer laughing. She was afraid. Bridget did not enjoy seeing it. She had not been raised on revenge. Leon finally admitted, after another 30 seconds of failed inputs, that they would need at least 20 minutes to isolate the fault, reset the controller, and run a clean transfer cycle. Amanda did not let him finish. She said Henry did not have 20 minutes. She said if the operating room was not stabilized within the next several minutes, the surgical team would lose its window. Audrey asked Leon if there was any manual fallback. Leon hesitated. He admitted there was a procedure described in the original system schematics, an old method of bridging the transfer manually using the auxiliary diesel generator and the medical battery bank. But the procedure had never been performed under live conditions. If the timing was wrong, the surgical wing would lose power for several seconds. In a pediatric cardiac case, several seconds was a lifetime. Audrey looked at William Prescott. He did not rescue her. He simply said that she was the chief executive and that she had to decide. The room felt smaller than it had ever felt. Audrey realized, without being told, that every sentence she had spoken on stage that evening was now lined up to testify against her. She had stood under those lights and promised the system was safe. She had laughed at the man who had tried to warn her. Flynn took a step forward. He did not raise his hand. He did not raise his voice. He said plainly that he could keep the operating room stable long enough for the surgical team to start. Leon turned on him at once. He told Flynn that he was not authorized to touch the system. He cited the certifications, the permissions, the internal protocols. Flynn looked at Leon without anger. He said they did not need to restart the entire facility. They needed to drop every known central load in the building, isolate operating theater, and hold the essentials, the ventilator, the surgical lights, the cardiac monitor, the infusion pumps, and the clean air pressure, on a balanced manual feed between the diesel generator and the battery bank. He said it would buy them about 3 minutes of clean transition, long enough for the controller to break out of its loop. Leon said that was not part of the current operational procedure. Flynn said it was not part of the current procedure because the current procedure had been written for a system that was working. The room went silent. Audrey looked at him. The doubt in her was no longer a wall. It was a window, narrow but real. Something in his voice was different from every voice in the room. Everyone else was loud because they were afraid. He was quiet because he was certain. Amanda asked Flynn directly. She asked if he did this, would the operating room be safe? Flynn answered that it would be stable enough for her to save the boy. But he needed everyone in the room to do exactly what he told them, exactly when he told them. Every head in the room turned toward Audrey. The decision was hers. The cost of saying no, in the seconds she had left, was a child. The cost of saying yes was admitting, in front of her board, her engineers, and her cameras, that she had been wrong. Audrey did not enjoy the shame of it, but she understood in that instant that real leadership did not mean never being wrong. It meant being able to say so, in time, when something more important than her dignity was at stake. She turned to Leon. Her voice was lower than it had been all evening. She told him to give him access. Leon did not move. She said, again more clearly, to let him through. Leon stepped aside. Audrey looked at Flynn one more time. She asked him almost quietly, what made him sure he knew what he was doing. The question was not the same question she had asked an hour earlier. An hour earlier she had been demanding a credential. Now she was asking for a reason to trust a stranger. Flynn did not boast. He glanced briefly at Bridget, who was pressed against the wall, eyes wide, the rabbit clutched to her chest. He did not want to say what he was about to say in front of his daughter, because she had never heard most of it, but he understood that the room needed it. He told Audrey that he had spent years running emergency electrical systems for military medical units. He had stabilized hospital wings during storms. He had stood in rooms where the lights were not allowed to go out, no matter what was falling outside. He had not retired from that work because he had failed at it. He had retired from it because his wife had asked him, before she died, to make sure their daughter never grew up with a father who was always away. William Prescott studied him. He asked why his file listed him only as a contracted technician. Flynn said that was the job he had taken that day. It was not the whole of who he was. The sentence did something to the room. It rearranged the air. The investors who had laughed earlier were no longer laughing. Leon had stopped objecting. Bridget stepped forward. Her voice was small but very clear. She said her daddy knew how to fix things. The room, for the second time that evening, went silent. But this silence was different. The first silence had been embarrassment for Flynn. This one was embarrassment for everybody else. Audrey looked at Bridget, and something inside her broke quietly. She had spent 4 years protecting her name. In one careless sentence, she had taught a 6-year-old that her father could be laughed at by strangers. There were many things Audrey could fix that night. She was not sure that one of them could be unfixed. She gave the order. The non-essential systems were to be cut. The lobby lighting, the promotional displays, the escalators, the demonstration units, the decorative arrays, the audio system, the guest lounges. Anything that did not directly serve operating Theater 2 was to be powered down immediately. The Grand Surgical Center began quietly to dim. Screens that had been broadcasting the company's vision went black. Hallway lights faded to emergency strips. Escalators stopped mid-step. The building seemed to be shedding its own glamour, layer by layer, until what was left was the only room that had ever truly mattered. Flynn opened the auxiliary panel. He did not glance at the central display. He used a hand meter, an old habit from a different life. He confirmed what he had suspected. The transfer relay was sitting between 2 states. It was alive, but indecisive. Forcing it through software would lock the protective circuits. Pulling it manually at the wrong moment would drop the operating room below safe voltage for several seconds. He needed to pull it at the exact instant the load demand dropped low enough to allow a clean handoff. He asked Leon to stand by the load monitor and call out the percentage at every change. He asked another engineer to watch the diesel generator's temperature. He asked Amanda to confirm the minimum essential equipment for Theater 2, and she did, fast and precise. He asked Audrey to issue each shutdown order personally, because the staff needed to hear the chief executive's voice on the line, not a contractor's. Audrey did exactly as she was told. There was no resistance left in her, only an unfamiliar quietness, a kind of focus she had not used in years. Flynn rested his hand on the manual transfer lever. He did not pull it yet. He listened to the diesel generator humming below them, low and uneven. He had heard that sound before, on a hospital ship in a heavy sea, the night the lights almost went out over a child being given a transfusion. He had counted that night too. Leon called out that auxiliary load was at 64%. Flynn told him to cut the East Hall. Audrey gave the order. The East Hall went dark. Leon called out 57% octi. Flynn told him to cut the decorative lighting on the first floor. Audrey gave the order. The first floor displays went dark. Leon called out 49%. Amanda's voice came over the intercom. Theater 2 was prepped. Henry was in position. They needed clean power immediately. Flynn closed his eyes for one breath. He counted the rhythm of the generator. Not in numbers. In feel. He had trained himself, years ago, to recognize the moment a generator settled into the small dip that came right before its next stable cycle. It lasted less than a second. He had spent half a lifetime learning to find it. Erzong. 2. Dear. How. E. Dewal. He pulled the lever. The lights in the control hub dropped for half a second. Bridget gasped and pressed both hands against her chest. She cried out for her father. Then the monitor for Theater 2 glowed steady green. The ventilator hummed. The infusion pumps held their rate. The cardiac monitor traced its small, steady line. The surgical lamps came up to full strength. Amanda's voice returned. Calm now, professional. They had stable power. The procedure was beginning. Leon stared at the readings as if they had betrayed him by working. The engineers behind him stood very still. William Prescott exhaled, and the sound was small enough that only the people closest to him heard it. The investors did not cheer. They were not in a cheering mood. They were in the deeper kind of quiet that came after a near miss. Flynn did not smile. He did not lift his head triumphantly. He simply asked Amanda, through the intercom, how long the operating room would need stable power. Amanda said at least 90 minutes for the most dangerous phase of the surgery. Flynn nodded. He told her he would stay on the panel and ride the manual feed himself until the engineering team could safely isolate the fault and bring the automatic transfer back online. Bridget walked slowly to him. She did not speak. She simply pressed her face against the side of his leg, and he placed his hand on her hair without taking his other hand off the panel. The people in the room watched them, and not a single person looked away with discomfort. They looked the way people look when they realize, late, that the most important person in a room had been standing in the corner the whole time. Henry Miller's surgery began on time. Dr. Price would later say it had been one of the most challenging pediatric cardiac repairs of her career. Flynn rode the manual feed for the entire first hour, balancing the diesel generator and the battery bank by hand, while the engineering team finally diagnosed and isolated the original fault. When the automatic system was carefully brought back online, Flynn stepped back from the panel only after Amanda confirmed that the boy had passed the most dangerous phase. Word spread through the building before the rain stopped. Investors who had been preparing to leave instead waited. The reporters who had been escorted out earlier had not gone far. Something about the night had shifted, and even people who did not understand transfer relays understood that. Audrey stood outside the control hub. The dress that had been chosen for triumph now looked simply like a dress. Her hair was no longer perfectly placed. The careful expression she had worn all day was gone, and what remained on her face was something quieter and more honest. She had watched her company nearly fail because she had refused to listen to the one person who could see what no one else had seen. Leon Hardwell could not look at Flynn. William Prescott walked over and thanked Flynn first, before anyone else, and that simple act rearranged the hierarchy of the evening more thoroughly than any announcement could have. Flynn did not enjoy it. He told William he had only done what anyone who understood the system should have done. Audrey understood that a private apology would not be enough. The wound had been public. So would the repair. She walked over to Flynn. The board, the engineers, the doctors, and Bridget were all watching. Audrey did not soften her voice for sympathy. She did not perform. She said she had been wrong. She said she had judged him by his appearance and his title. She said she had refused to listen when he had tried to warn them. She said she was sorry. The room did not move. This was the moment Flynn could have chosen to be cruel. He could have repeated her words back to her. He could have made her stand there longer than necessary. He could have made the room laugh at her the way it had once almost laughed at him. He did not. He looked at her, and he looked at his daughter, and he said that he did not need her to be ashamed. He needed her to listen next time, before it was too late. Audrey's eyes did not water in front of the room. They would later, when she was alone. But in that moment she only nodded, once, because his sentence had struck somewhere deeper than apology could reach. Bridget ran to him. He lifted her into his arms. He asked her if she had been afraid. She shook her head into his shoulder and said, very softly, that she had not been afraid when he was there. Audrey heard it. Whatever was left of the woman who had stood at the front of the room hours earlier did not survive that sentence. The chief executive's posture did not break, but something behind her posture did. Hours later, when the hallways had emptied and the storm had passed, Audrey found Flynn near the front entrance. Bridget had fallen asleep on a long bench, the rabbit tucked under her arm. The cold blue light of the building reflected off the wet glass. Audrey was no longer using her chief executive voice. She spoke to him the way she might have spoken to him if she had been a different person earlier in the day. She offered him a position. Not a contract. Not a seasonal consulting role. A real seat at the company, leading emergency safety oversight for Whitmore Medical Systems, with full authority to override any procedure he deemed dangerous. She said the company needed a man who could hear what its engineers could not. Flynn did not answer immediately. He looked at his sleeping daughter. Then he looked back at Audrey. He told her he would consider it, but only on one condition. Whatever role he took could not be a role that took him away from his daughter. He had not left his old career so that he could lose her in a new one. If Whitmore Medical Systems wanted him, it would have to want him as a father first. Audrey watched him, and for the first time that night, she smiled. Not the rehearsed smile she used for cameras, not the strategic smile she used for boards. A small, surprised smile, the kind that lives at the edges of someone discovering something they had not expected. She told him that perhaps the company should learn to protect families before it talked about saving lives. Flynn looked at her for a long moment. The defenses he had carried into the building that morning had not entirely come down. They probably would not for a while. But he saw something in her now that he had not seen before. He saw a woman who was capable of being wrong out loud, and that was, in his experience, one of the rarest things any leader could become. He picked Bridget up gently, careful not to wake her. The rabbit dangled from her small hand. He turned toward the door. Audrey did not stop him. She simply stood at the glass and watched as he crossed the lobby, the security lights reflecting in the puddles on the wet pavement outside. Earlier in the evening, she had told him to stay back. Now she was the one standing still, and she was not entirely sure why she felt, with such surprising clarity, that she did not want him to walk too far. Outside, the rain had thinned to a fine mist. Flynn carried his daughter through the doors and into the cool, washed clean air of the city. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had spent the evening proving nothing to anyone except, perhaps, to one small girl who had needed to see a room full of strangers learn what she had always known. Bridget stirred in his arms. She murmured, half asleep, that she had been right about him. Flynn smiled into the dark. He had not won the night the way men win things in stories. He had not delivered a speech. He had not humiliated anyone. He had simply held a transfer relay steady at the right moment and let the rest of the room come, slowly, to its senses. Sometimes that was what dignity looked like. Not loud. Not proud. Just the quiet refusal to disappear when a room full of important people decided you should. And sometimes, very rarely, it was enough to make a beautiful, brilliant, frightened woman stand at a glass wall in the rain and wonder, for the first time in years, whether she had been calling the wrong things important all along.